So last time we ended by just getting a little bit into part 2 of the class. Basically, I've divided the class up into 3 parts. Part 1 was Jewish culture, part 2, Greco Roman culture, and then in part 3, I want to look at the Jewish wars and some of what happened like right after the end of the Old Testament to sort of see how things developed. But we're just starting in on the Greco Roman culture. So last time we just took a really quick overview of the Roman Empire. We saw that by the 1st century AD and a little while after that, the Roman Empire contained roughly 1 out of every 5 people living at the time. So about 20% of the total human population of the 1st century lived in the Roman Empire, which would have been about 45 million people. You have to remember that the world population at the time was probably less than the U.S. population now. So 1 out of every 5 would have been about 45 million people in total. And the culture of the Roman Empire, even though it was a Roman Empire, the culture was much more Greek in that the Romans had conquered the Greeks, but had really absorbed a lot of their philosophy, a lot of their culture, their religion, all of that. And so the culture that they spread was really more Greek culture than Roman culture, especially in the eastern part of the empire, which is where, the Jews lived and where a lot of the New Testament takes place. You don't really see much in the New Testament about the western half of the empire. Supposedly, Paul eventually did take a trip to Spain, or what is nowadays Spain, but that would have been after the time the book of Acts was finished, so we don't have biblical record of that. But the Romans still, had a large part of their culture. A lot of the Romans really made advances in things like law and architecture and the like, and, a lot of which is still very influential today. So, any questions before we get started? So, let's take a look now at just the overview of how Roman society was set up. And like pretty much any ancient society, including Jewish society, Roman society was very, very stratified. You had very distinct social classes, and there was little to no chance of moving between them. Whatever you were born, that was pretty much how you stayed. And there were sort of 3 overall general classes. The highest class, what was called the nobiles, and you can hear from that the root of our English word of noble or nobility. And these were the people who had the really high-level positions in the government and the military. The highest of the high level were people like the senators or what were called the patricians. The patrician class, Patrician, the patrician class was the high level of Roman society. They were the social and the governing elite. They were, again, the people in the Senate. They were the high government officials and the like. And then directly under them, you had the overall aristocracy, what was called the equestrian class. And, of course, equestrian meaning having to do with horses, because these were the people who were rich enough to own horses and ride horses. In fact, later on, the equestrian class would actually be known as the knightly class, as in like knights on horses. But when you say that, don't think of like knights in shining armor. That's medieval knights. The Roman equestrian class was basically, again, just this upper level, just below the very highest level class. And again, they were also the higher level people in the government and the military. But the equestrian class also included people like really wealthy businessmen, merchants, moneylenders, government contractors, people like that. And then just under them, you had sort of the highest of the commoners, the people who weren't officially nobles, but were very, very wealthy commoners. Usually people who were very well connected in the government. Again, you also had people like the tax collectors and the like, who, even if they weren't very well liked, nonetheless had a lot of money. So this was the highest level, the nobilis, the ruling elite of Roman culture, and of course, very, very much in the minority. The common people, the vast majority of people, were the plebeians. That's Plebebians, the plebeians. And this was the lower class. These were the farmers, the common laborers, artisans who weren't good enough to be super rich artisans, craftsmen, shopkeepers, soldiers, sailors, and just the standard urban masses. And there was always a fairly large unemployed underclass in Roman society called the proletariat. You might be familiar with that term from like Marxism, but Marx stole it from the Romans. So this was the lower class, either the people holding less high-paying jobs or people who just didn't have jobs at all. The plebeian class also included a lot of freed slaves, were known as freedmen. And these were people who had been slaves but had somehow gained their freedom either by buying it, because a lot of slaves were able to, some slaves were able to save up and actually purchase their freedom. Other slaves might be free due to very good service to their masters. Others could be freed in their master's will. But so you had a large population of freed slaves that was also part of this sort of underclass. So then you had the very, very lowest level of Roman society, which were the slaves. And this was a huge amount. Slaves contributed about 15 to 20% of the population in the city of Rome itself. So then about 1 in every 5 people in Rome was a slave. And this proportion got even higher if you looked at the empire as a whole. So slavery was huge in the Roman Empire. Now, there's sort of 2 pitfalls people tend to fall into in thinking about Roman slavery and talking about Roman slavery, especially when it comes to people in church. One is to fall into the usual trap of equating Roman slavery with American slavery and thinking that the Roman slaves were just like slaves were in like the antebellum South. But it's not an incredibly accurate comparison. For one thing, Roman slavery was not race-based. You weren't a slave because of your race. You could become a slave because your people had been conquered by the Romans. And, when the Romans would conquer people, they would take some of those people back to Rome as slaves. Not all of them. They weren't interested in enslaving entire populations. But some of the people would be taken back to Rome as slaves. You could become a slave by being convicted of a crime. Of course, if you were born to a slave, you were automatically a slave. You could become a slave by defaulting on your debts. And usually in those cases, people would sell themselves into slavery as a way of, paying off their debts. So, not race-based like American slavery, also not completely chattel slavery. But slaves were seen as, quote, living tools. That's what they weren't necessarily seen as property in the same way that American slaves were. But they weren't seen really as people either. Aristotle called slaves living tools. And in fact, Aristotle and a lot of the other philosophers argued that there were people who were just slaves by nature. And this is how they justified slavery. They said there were people who just by nature were slaves, and the best thing for them was to be slaves so that they could be taken care of. Now, this was a very similar argument that was made in America for, again, race-based slavery, but the Greeks and Romans weren't arguing for this based on race. They were just arguing for it based on that they were just people who were naturally slaves.
Do you think that it could be that by human nature, people feel like slavery, deep down inside we think, well, that seems wrong.
Yeah.
Slavery's wrong.
It's wrong, but it's been very convenient over the course of human history. But yeah, I think there probably is. Well, again, we have the law of God written on our hearts, and that tells us that all people are created equal. All people are created in God's image, and that should tell us in itself that there's something wrong with slavery, with having complete control over another human being like that. But, it always pops up constantly through human history because it's a very convenient thing. And it can lead to a lot of economic prosperity in certain ways because, if you can get free labor, you have money to spend on other things. So it's a very sort of pernicious thing that keeps coming up. But, it's always been at least somewhat uncomfortable for people, and so they try to find ways to justify it.
But it's just a trade-off of them providing lodging and food and so forth.
Yeah.
Till it goes beyond.
Mm-hmm. So that's sort of one way we can misunderstand Roman slavery, to think it was like American slavery. Another way, and I hear this in churches a lot, is people talk about Roman slavery as though it were equivalent to Jewish slavery, the kind that's described in the Mosaic Law. And it also wasn't that, because if you look at the Mosaic Law, the kind of slavery it describes is more like indentured servitude, where you would become a slave, usually to pay off debts, and a lot of times it was a limited thing. You were a slave for a while, and then you were freed. And your children weren't necessarily slaves, and there are a lot of protections laid in place. And so a lot of times pastors will talk about Roman slavery like it was Jewish slavery in an attempt to sort of justify the fact that the New Testament doesn't outright condemn slavery. But in fact, Roman slavery was much, much worse than Jewish slavery. It didn't have all the built-in safeguards that the Mosaic Law put in place. So a slave's life usually was a very harsh and brutal thing. Slaves performed most of the hard manual labor on the farms and in the mines. And so a lot of the hard labor in the Roman Empire was done by slaves. And they would also serve as most of the household servants as well. And in fact, if you were a rich person, if you were part of the rich elite, owning slaves was a sign of prestige. It was a sign of status. And it was essential. They would not be able to maintain their very privileged lifestyle without slave labor. So most patricians, most of the higher class, would own dozens of slaves. And most of the nobiles, the noble class in general, would at least own 2 or 3. And a master's control over his slaves was total. He had life and death authority over his slaves. Of course, they would also have life and death authority over their family as well. We'll talk about that later. But they had it over their slaves, and cruelty was very, very common. A master could condemn his slave to death. And usually if that happened, the master would, they would hire the local executioner to actually kill the slave. And the only thing they would have to pay for would be the cost of materials needed to burn the slave's body. So to condemn a slave to death was no big deal, and it was a very cheap thing to do. And they could do it for any reason. In the courts, a slave's testimony would only be considered acceptable if it was given under torture. So slaves were seen as inherently dishonest. And so the only way a slave's testimony could be taken in court was if it was actually given under torture. And a lot of times this would happen by the government to force slaves to testify against their masters. In terms of marriage and family, there was no official marriage for slaves. Slaves were not seen as human enough to be able to get married. And so slaves did not have either wives or officially a slave didn't have children. The child of a slave belonged to the master. It wouldn't belong to the slave. And their, sleeping together and having children was basically seen as on the level of livestock breeding. And a slave would not actually be allowed to, quote, breed except by the permission of the master. And any children born to a male slave was the property of that slave's master. So, if your slave had children, another one of your slaves, you got them. If your female slave had children with the male slave of someone else, that person got their kids. But it was a very, very dehumanizing system. So, not exactly the same as American slavery, but not the lenient, safeguarded system that the Mosaic Law had either. Now, slavery was not universally seen as okay, and a lot of writers, both Greek writers, Roman writers, and Jewish writers, did try to ameliorate the harsh conditions. They did encourage good treatment of slaves, and they really tried to create a sort of benevolent slavery. They would try to encourage an ideal situation where the master took care of their slave in return for the slave working for their master. That was seen as the ideal. And again, that was portrayed by Jewish writers, Greek writers, and Roman writers. So again, that was the ideal, but the reality usually was pretty different. Now, another way in which slavery in the Roman Empire was very different than American slavery was in the U.S., in, antebellum slavery, almost all slaves were the lowest of the low. It was very rare for a slave to attain any sort of social status. That wasn't the case in the Roman Empire. You could have slaves who actually would attain a very high social status. And in fact, some slaves would end up economically better off than most Roman citizens. There were slaves that were referred to as the, quote, household of Caesar, who actually helped to govern the empire. A lot of mid-level and low-level government officials were actually officially the slaves of Caesar. And he owned them, but they nonetheless held positions of some authority. And so you found these throughout the empire. Also, a lot of slaves would work as tutors for the children of the elite, especially, if you bought like a really highly educated Greek slave who could teach your child Greek philosophy and Greek ideas, you would put them to work educating your children. And other slaves would act as, administrators for their master's households. And again, you would have slaves who would actually have authority over, non-slaves who would be put in positions of authority and power where they would actually be able to accumulate a fair amount of wealth for themselves. And they could actually be friends of their master. So slaves did have more social mobility in a lot of ways than the standard Roman mob did. If you were, a slave who was put in a high enough position by your master. Also, there were masters who would emancipate the slaves in their wills. And it was possible, again, for slaves to purchase their freedom. Slaves would usually be given on a regular basis a small amount of money called a peculium. That's where we get the word peculiar from. Remember the Bible, it talks of us being a peculiar people. The word comes from the private property of someone like a slave or a soldier who would have only a small amount of private possessions, and everything else they own would be given to them either by the government or by their master. Their own property was referred to as peculium, and hence we are referred to as a peculiar people because we are the private property of God. But slaves would be given this, sort of more or less allowance on a regular basis, and they could save that up and over time potentially be able to buy their freedom. Now, emancipated slaves were expected to remain loyal to their master. And later we'll talk about what's called the patron-client system. That was the basis of a lot of Roman society, how society was structured. And slaves would become what were called the clients of their master. And they would still be considered part of the master's household and expected to more or less work for the master, but they would no longer be slaves. Which is better than other slaves who, would be emancipated and just sort of sent out on their own and not be able to support themselves. So, and again, social mobility could actually be better for freed slaves than it would be for a lot of the Roman mob. So slavery was a very sort of mixed bag. It was a very cruel system. It was a very harsh system. The lives of most slaves of the Roman Empire were very, hard. But it could also be a way of attaining social advancement. If you had, if you were a slave who was educated, who was intelligent, who could, really do their master a lot of good, rather than just being someone they could put to work. So slavery is a big part of the Roman Empire. And again, you see it referenced all the time in the New Testament. Paul is always referring to himself as a slave of God. And, this is the background. This is the kind of slavery he's thinking of when he talks about that. So the whole Roman social system was very much based on classism, elitism, and exploitation. The legal codes, the taxes were very much skewed in favor of the rich. People try to claim that modern day laws are just, are all written for the rich, but the Roman law really was. It was written very much to favor the rich over the poor. Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, one of the great works on Roman history, said that under the Roman Empire, the labor of an industrious and an ingenious people was incessantly exploited in the service of the rich. In their dress, their dining, their houses, and their furniture, the elite utilized every refinement of convenience, of elegance, and of splendor, whatever could soothe their pride or gratify their sensuality. And you see this reflected, again, a lot in the New Testament, especially in James, when James talks about how to treat the rich and how to treat the poor. This type of situation, this setup, was the background of what he was thinking of. Because, they were in a society that was already very much skewed to favor the rich, and James was determined that the church would not follow that example. That's why he says, he tells rich women to dress modestly. When James, when it's talking about modesty, it's not talking about sexuality, it's talking about economics. It's saying don't flaunt your wealth, because, there was a lot of resentment among the poor for the rich because they had been so exploited. And James was trying to avoid seeing these divisions develop in the church that he was already seeing. Another thing to keep in mind with Roman society is that in the larger cities, like Rome, where the underclass, the plebeian class, was truly huge, the proletariat, this mob of the under and unemployed, was a constant threat to social order. The governing authorities was always afraid of the mob, afraid of what the mob would do, what could happen if the mob rioted. And the mob, they were ignorant, they were uneducated, they were impoverished, perpetually unemployed, and they were often very disgruntled, very disorderly. And so, to keep the mob pacified, Roman authorities provided welfare. There were just constant handouts handouts of grain to feed the poor, to keep them from rioting, and constant entertainment. Because if you're unemployed, you have nothing else to do all day. You either sit around, twiddle your thumbs and think about rebelling, or you go to see entertainment. Which, so the Roman Empire, the government was constantly supplying entertainment in the form of chariot races, in the form of mock naval battles, in the form of gladiatorial games. So this is where we get the term panet es circuses, bread and circuses. You might have heard that used before as a way of sort of describing modern society, being consumed by entertainment. The same thing was happening here. The Roman government supplied bread and circuses. They supplied a bare minimum amount of food to keep people from rioting. They supplied entertainment to keep them distracted. And, circuses here refers to things like the Circus Maximus, which was the great arena in Rome where people would go and watch the entertainment.
But wasn't a lot of their entertainment like the lions eating people?
That was very entertaining.
Yeah.
It was brutal. Gladiatorial fights.
Didn't they get in the arena and fight and one of them was killed?
So that was gladiatorial fights usually weren't to the death because it costs a lot of money to train a gladiator, but they were to at least first blood, and they were trained to be very showy and to provide a very bloody show without actually inflicting mortal wounds. They would reenact battles, like historical battles, even naval battles, where they would flood the Colosseum and have people on boats and fight. And these were usually done manned by slaves or by convicted criminals because most of the people would die. Or, criminals would be fed to wild animals. It wasn't just Christians, but convicted criminals would be fed to wild animals. And this was entertaining because you got to see a lion or a tiger or a bear, something you didn't see, in Rome. And you got to see someone eating.
But
and,
you
hey,
also
that's
learned
cool.
a lesson. That,
you don't want to be them.
Kind of cruel, but
there was no conception whatsoever of that entertainment should not be cruel, because cruelty was entertaining. It was cruel to people. It was cruel to people. It was cruel to animals.
The horses and they got the javelin, the spear. And they run and they.
Oh, that's jousting. That's medieval.
Yeah.
That there were, because of the church, there were a lot of safeguards put in place in medieval tournaments to reduce bloodshed and deaths. The medieval church actually really worked to make things like tournaments as safe as possible. Whereas the Romans, more death the better. Maybe not with gladiators, because again it was expensive to train a gladiator, but with like convicted criminals or just the dregs of their slaves, go kill them. There was no consideration of kindness or the value of life or anything. That was all brought by Christianity. No, people think of the medieval period as being very bloodthirsty and very dangerous, and it was, but it was nowhere near what it could have been, because the Catholic Church, which for all its problems was still a Christian church, was really fighting to reduce the amount of cruelty. And you didn't have any of that in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire celebrated cruelty because they celebrated above all bravery, and the way to express your bravery was to be cruel to those who couldn't defend themselves. There was no conception of anything like chivalry, of defending the weak. That all came through Christianity. So again, read things like the Gospels and the epistles of Paul with that in mind, and realize how countercultural everything Jesus and the apostles said was. That they were living in a society that we really cannot comprehend fully, because it's our society has absorbed so much Christian morality. Even if nowadays it's trying to get rid of it, it doesn't realize just how much of it still has. So because of all of this, Roman citizenship was very highly prized. Because if you were a citizen, you could avoid a lot of this cruelty. At least in theory, citizens were guaranteed equal justice under the law, and they had the right to appeal to Caesar if they thought the local officials were giving them a raw deal. And again, you see this, Paul uses this multiple times in Acts. He would trot out his Roman citizenship all the time. Because even though he was suffering for Christ and he rejoiced in the suffering, he knew there was no reason to suffer unnecessarily. And being a Roman citizen allowed him to avoid a lot of the worst. It allowed him to avoid just, the local officials just throwing him in a dungeon and forgetting about it. It allowed him to avoid things like, severe beatings or executions. There were executions like crucifixion that you could not give a Roman citizen. You couldn't beat a Roman citizen to death. You couldn't just hold them in a dungeon indefinitely. And again, if a Roman citizen believed that they were being given an unjust sentence, they could appeal to Caesar, and that was an absolute right. Any Roman citizen could go have their case heard by Caesar. And Paul used that actually to get to Rome. I mean, he very deliberately made an appeal to Caesar so he could be taken to Rome and preach in Rome. And that's actually what's happening at the end of Acts. He makes it to Rome, he's under house arrest, and he preaches Christ to everyone who comes and sees him. And we're not told, Acts ends there, so we don't actually see what happens when he's taken before Caesar, but I'm sure he preached then too. So citizens had the right to appeal to Caesar. They were exempt from the worst forms of punishment like flogging and crucifixion. So if you were a Roman citizen, it really exempted you from a lot of the worst of Roman law. And so being a Roman citizen, especially in the time of the New Testament, was a very, very prized thing. And it was a very uncommon thing. It was bizarre for Paul to be a Jew with Roman citizenship. It was not at all common. Roman citizenship would become much more common later. And its value would be very much diluted by that. But during the first century, it was still a very prized thing.
Paul was beheaded.
He was beheaded. That was way more merciful than crucifixion. I mean, that was the way you wanted to go. That's always been the way the elite have been executed. That's why the guillotine was invented. Not because people thought it was horrible, but because people wanted they wanted a way to execute everyone evenly and equally and cleanly. Now, it was overused, but
pretty clean.
but that's the thing. It's fast. Unlike every other form of execution, was a long, drawn-out, protracted process.
It was torture.
Yeah, it was torture. Even things we have today, like the electric chair, it's torture. Lethal injection, beheading, still the fastest way to go. So yeah, Paul was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. Peter was crucified because he wasn't. Maybe upside down. That's a later addition, but maybe upside down. But we're fairly certain he was crucified. Any other questions? So that's sort of overall how Roman society was set up. So let's take a quick look at how the government worked. How was the Roman government set up? So Rome gained a lot of its empire while it was still a republic. But a few decades before Christ, Augustus Caesar switched the republic into an empire. So
Republic being
meaning where they at least still technically had a representative form of government. You had a Senate and proconsuls and praetors who were actually elected officials. Now, only the higher level classes could vote, but there were theoretically even representatives for the lower classes. There were representatives for the plebeians. So the Roman Republic was, at least in theory, a representative form of government. But Augustus more or less switched to the empire. Now, it wasn't like it was like a switch being thrown and suddenly everything just became like, Caesar and no one else. There was still a Senate, and there were still proconsuls and all these other positions that were still theoretically holding a lot of power, but their influence became less and less. And it was really just Caesar who was in charge. And Augustus starts the era of what's called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And this lasts for roughly a century or so, when within the border of the Roman Empire, you were safe. If you were within the borders of the Roman Empire, you didn't have to worry about foreign invasion. You didn't, on the major Roman roads, you didn't have to worry about bandits. Things were kept pretty safe. And that allowed for trade, that allowed for communication, that very much allowed for the growth of the early church. And it was really the first of its kind in history when the everyday person could really live feeling more or less secure. Not that their lives were great, but they were secure. Now, the emperorship, at least initially for the first few emperors, was a hereditary system. So the emperor was a hereditary monarch, not always father to son. In fact, that didn't happen very much. But at least all the emperors up until Nero were at least of the same family. They were all related to Caesar, hence why they were called Caesar. It was only later that the emperor in general would be called Caesar. The early ones were all called Caesar because that was their family. So it was initially a more or less hereditary position with near absolute power. And it was basically a military dictatorship. The word that we get emperor from is imperator, which is what the emperor was called. And it literally means head of the army, because that's what the emperor was. He was the head of the army. And later emperors would usually be installed by the army. So the Roman system was essentially a military dictatorship. Officially, the emperor was confirmed by the Senate, but that was really just a rubber stamp. The Senate didn't have any real power. The emperor appointed the high-level political people. He presided over the bureaucracy. And, as has been mentioned, he functioned as a one-man Supreme Court. Any Roman emperor could appeal to have Caesar hear their case. And then, of course, Caesar's ruling on their case was final. There was no one higher than that. So you had the emperor, then you had the Senate, which again, by the time of Jesus in the early church, was an advisory body. It included the wealthiest, the most powerful men of the empire. It still held a lot of prestige. And so the elite would fight over positions in the Senate because it would give them prestige, and prestige would lead to power. And, a lot of senators would have the ear of the emperor. So this is what was going on in Rome itself. Away from Rome, in the outlying provinces like Judea, like, Samaria and the rest of them, you would have them ruled over by governors of some kind or another. Proconsuls would rule the oldest provinces, the really stable ones, the ones where there wasn't any threat of rebellion. Places like Greece, Egypt, North Africa. Those have been part of the empire so long that people there really thought of themselves as Roman. So there was very little chance of rebellion coming from them. So they would be ruled by proconsuls. And proconsuls usually did not have a standing army. They didn't need it. Then the more frontier provinces where there was a lot more chance of rebellion. Places like Syria or Gaul would be ruled over by legates. And legates were military governors. And they did have armies at their disposal because there was the chance that the people there could rise up in rebellion. And then the smaller provinces, the frontier, places like Judea, those would be ruled over by prefects. And again, that's more of what Pontius Pilate would have been. And as we mentioned before, all of these positions were usually very corrupt. There was usually very little concern with any real justice. And people would clamor for these positions because it gave them a lot of opportunity to amass wealth. And they wouldn't really, and their only concern would just be to keep the populace quiet and to keep the tax money rolling in. As long as that happened, Rome didn't really care what else you did. Now, there was some limitation in that because if the governor was too corrupt, if he angered the populace too much, then Rome would start to feel threatened and that governor would be removed. So you had to keep the populace happy enough so that they didn't threaten rebellion. But other than that, Rome didn't really care what you did. As long as you get the tax money rolling in. And because of that, the Roman Empire wasn't very centralized. We tend to think of dictatorships today like being China or the old USSR, where everything is super concentrated and the government has total control over everything and everybody's under this iron hand. And the Roman Empire wasn't like that because if you think about it, it couldn't have been like that. We can be that way nowadays because of modern technology. You need things like instantaneous communication to have a really dominating central government. And the Roman Empire didn't have that. It could take years for some edict of Caesar's or another to make its way through the empire. So in reality, the Roman Empire was more a federation of these semi-autonomous city-states. They were called civitates. So most cities had their own senate. They had their own elite, and they would have sort of their own local councils. And, the local influential citizens who want to be part of that aristocracy. And these local city-states would be more or less self-governing. And each city would have its own government. In a way, each city would have its own separate culture. Think about like the 7 churches at the beginning of Revelation. Each one is addressed differently. Even though these were all relatively close to each other, they are all sort of clustered in what's nowadays Western Turkey. They called it Asia Minor then. But they are each one a more or less independent city-state that had its own culture, its own issues, and, God was addressing each of them differently because of it. So you had more or less independent city-states, but ultimately they all had to obey Roman law, and most importantly, they all had to pay Roman taxes. Again, that's what the Romans were more concerned with than anything else. So corruption in government, again, was pretty much universal. The historian Paul Vane, in his book, A History of Private Life from Pagan Rome to Byzantium, writes this. In Rome, every superior stole from his subordinates. Every public function was a racket. Those in charge put the squeeze on their subordinates and altogether exploited the populace. Even the least important public positions were sold by their incumbents to aspiring candidates because every position carried with it a guaranteed income in the form of bribes. Public officials paid themselves. The troops that patrolled the countryside and were responsible for rural administration forced the towns and villages under their jurisdiction to vote them gratuities. Every official had his palm greased before taking the slightest action. Eventually, an official schedule of bribes was established and posted in every office, an act tantamount to legalized bribery. Supplicants were careful to bring money whenever they visited an official. Demanding payment of illegal taxes was big business among provincial governors. The central government in Rome allowed these abuses to continue, content to receive its due. Imperial authorities refrained from exhibiting too much curiosity about the way in which taxes were extorted for the peasantry. So think of like the most stereotypical South American banana republic where you have to bribe anyone to do anything, and that's what the entire Roman Empire was like. Keep that in mind.
That was cause of the fall.
Yeah. But keep that in mind when Paul still says, obey the government. That the government is instituted by God to punish evildoers. This is the government they were living under. And Paul was still saying, give it its due. Jesus still said, render to Caesar that which is Caesar's. And that the government is instituted by God. Not that the government is godly, but God ordained that there be governments. And of course, any government will be corrupted by men because men are corrupt.
You think even our country could?
Yeah. Yeah, when I was young and naive, I used to think, bribes and corruption, that happens elsewhere. We don't have it. Yeah. And of course, building projects were the worst. And there were always building projects going on in Rome. But civic building projects were basically money pits, in which corrupt contractors and conniving governors would basically just exploit the system. So again, if you were a government contractor, you were wealthy because you had an enormous amount of graft and bribes coming in. And again, according to Paul Vane, the cardinal virtue of the public official was tact, not honesty. It's like you were expected to be discreet in your corruption, but not honest. So that was the kind of government the early church lived under. And again, this is the kind of government that Paul and Jesus were thinking about when they talked about government. So then sort of the last branch of the government, of course, was the military. So Rome was built on its military. There was not really a separate police force. The idea of policing being a separate thing is a much more recent invention. Rome maintained law and order through its overpowering military and navy. In the time of Christ, the Roman Empire, the Roman army consisted of 28 legions, which together was around 300,000 men. Remember that the total population of the world was around 300 million. So in other words, about 1 out of every 100 people in the world was a member of the Roman army. So you had about 100,000 legionary forces. These were the professional soldiers. These are the ones you think of with like the Roman armor and the discipline and the formation. Those are the legion. That was the official professional army. Then you had more than 150,000 auxiliary troops drawn from the provinces. So these were the non-citizen soldiers. And this was a popular thing to do because if you went and served in the Roman army for 20 years, you would gain citizenship and you would be given a parcel of land. So there was a lot of incentive to be part of the Roman army. Now, the Roman army was not allowed to be in Rome itself. You might have heard about Caesar crossing the Rubicon. You might have heard that expression. And that was seen as a big deal because Caesar brought his legions into Rome. He crossed into the region of Rome itself, which was a direct threat to the Roman government, and you weren't allowed to do that. You were not supposed to have Roman armies in Rome itself. The troops were stationed in the provinces to guard against revolts and foreign invasions. Now, this would become less and less so as time went on, as the emperors more and more had to be sort of propped up by the military. You would have the military in Rome more and more. But initially, the military was for out there. It was to protect the borders. It was to keep the provinces stable. You did have in Rome what was called the Praetorian Guard. And this was something separate. This was an elite cohort of 500 soldiers who were stationed in Rome itself. And they were stationed there as the emperor's personal bodyguard. So they weren't part of the normal legions. This was a separate elite force. Later on, it would be largely the Praetorian Guard who would be responsible for installing emperors. No longer just protecting them. They would determine who the emperor was. Not surprisingly, in places like Judea, where Roman rule was very much hated, Roman soldiers were very much hated. And again, when you have people like Jesus and Peter dealing with Roman soldiers, this would have been seen as very much outside the pale. Now, there were some Roman soldiers, like there was a Roman centurion in the Gospels who's described as being very loved by the Jews because he donated a lot of money to things like the temple and the like. But for the most part, the Roman soldiers were hated by the Jews because they were very much a symbol of Roman oppression. And, they were very cruel and very violent themselves. Which is why there was a lot of question in the early church over should Christians be soldiers? Because to be a soldier in the Roman army is to partake in that level of cruelty and just outright evil. And so, there was a lot of question in the early church, could you be a soldier and be a Christian? And we have, stories of people who were Roman soldiers, became Christians, left, and were executed for it. Because it was not legal to leave the Roman army before your term was up. I mean, you would be executed if you tried to. But they believed that they could not be Christians and soldiers. Well, because to be a Roman soldier, you had to do really, really mean things. And you had to, or if you disobeyed your orders, you'd be executed. And so they believed that, you couldn't be a soldier. You couldn't serve two masters. You couldn't serve the empire and God. You couldn't have allegiance to two different things. Any last questions? So, this is a very good breaking point. Next time, we'll really start to dig into Roman culture.